Hey, how's it going everybody? My name is Jaden and I am a third year mechanical engineering student at the University of Sheffield. And in this quick video, I'm going to be going over some of my experience working over here. I'm going to be highlighting a huge mistake I made during my internship so that you won't be making these mistakes during your years in industry. But first, a bit of a backstory. Prestige Automobiles is basically the sole agent for BMW, Mini, Hyundai and Rolls-Royce in Sri Lanka. And in addition to their marketing and selling cars aspect, they also have a repair and service division as well. And this is where the more engineering related stuff goes on. And it is at this repair and service division that I got my first hands-on experience with a bit of mechanical engineering. Although yes, this is mostly the job of a mechanic and not a mechanical engineer, you do need to know the basics without just diving into the deep end. And a bit of a disclaimer before we go ahead, I don't have too many good pictures of my experience because obviously it's a private facility and I can't be posting pictures of their inner workings online. But I do have a few, so let's dive into it. My role was basically working with the other mechanics to learn basically anything I could in that 2-week period that I had. And that was my goal. I didn't have anything specific because I was new to this whole thing. So here's a few of the automotive systems I worked on. I ran some software updates on cars so that they are up to date in terms of security. And I also replaced some of the brake discs on a BMW X1. I changed the gearbox oil in a BMW 7 Series. Trust me, that stuff stinks. I was also engaged in replacing the hybrid battery of a BMW i3 because for some reason certain models had a manufacturing defect and whatever cars that were produced in that batch had to be rewired. Unfortunately, I couldn't really do that hands-on because of the high voltages and so on and the safety risks, so only the highest trained personnel were allowed to touch it, but I was around and that helped me observe the entire process. Before we get to the most interesting bit of my internship where I made the huge mistake, do check out my website if you want to see more of my work experience because it's all in one place and I go into more detail there. Anyway, the most interesting thing I did was building a BMW F10 engine from the ground up. And this is basically the engine that powers the BMW 5 Series. What basically happened is that this particular BMW 5 Series had sucked up water into its engine during a flood or something, and it had completely destroyed the internal components of the engine. Therefore, they don't usually ship an entire brand new engine, they ship the parts with a manual and you basically have to build it from the ground up. And that's where I came in. Me, along with the help of my supervisor, obviously because I didn't know what I was doing. We basically started building this engine and this project took about 4 days if I remember right, and it's not something that you can just do in a day. Just the first few days was just me getting used to all the tools and all the equipment, getting used to the nuts and bolts and the oils that we needed to apply so that the engine would run smoothly and so on. And slightly later on in the process, maybe around day 3, it was finally time to seat the top and bottom halves of the engine. And how this is done is basically you place the top half of the engine block on the bottom half with the help of a crane, and we use 12 massive screws around this size to fasten it in place. And as with most mechanical fastenings, we had to secure the engine block in this sort of sequence from the outside to the inside instead of going sequentially because that would offset the engine block. It's very similar to putting on a tire on a car. You don't really go in this order, you go like this, and so on. But my mistake wasn't in the fact that I tightened these screws in the wrong sequence. It was more to do with how I tightened these screws. I had to use an apparatus called an angle torque wrench. Yes, I had watched my supervisor use this thing before, but I hadn't used it myself. And conveniently during this time, my supervisor said, okay, I'm going for my lunch break and you've watched me use this so many times, so I'm sure you know how to use it. Do tighten these screws, because at this point the top two halves were on each other and the screws were just placed, they just hadn't been tightened. And it was my job while he was away to tighten these things to save time during our project. But it turned out that I had no clue how to use this thing. Basically, an angle torque wrench has a shaft that you rotate as you would on a normal wrench, except it also has a built-in protractor. And what basically stops this protractor rotating freely with the shaft is a magnet that's connected to it. Basically, you place this magnet on whatever metal surface and that locks the protractor in place so that when you turn the shaft, it basically gives you an angular reading. But again, I had no clue how to use this thing and I completely messed up. So I basically placed the magnet on the rotating shaft itself. Therefore, while I was turning the angle torque wrench, the protractor was rotating with it as well, and that obviously didn't give me any reading. Therefore, I tightened all the nuts to the wrong extent, which basically led some of the nuts to be too loose and some of them to be too tight. And unfortunately for me, since this was like the most important bit that keeps the top and bottom halves of the engine together, we couldn't just, unscrew the ones that were wrong and then re-screw them. We had to basically take the two halves back out and then put them back in to make sure they're seated correctly. And this obviously cost the project more time than it would have if, I just knew how to use that thing and I clarified with my supervisor how to use it before he left. And this unfortunately cost the project valuable time because it took more time to redo that whole thing compared to if I didn't mess up. Luckily, all the mechanics there are very skilled and they've done this multiple times. Therefore, they knew exactly what they had to do to get everything back on time and back on track. So technically it was all a happy ending because we managed to put the engine back in the car and it actually started up and ran smoothly, which was a huge relief knowing that you helped assemble this thing that was basically just nuts and bolts and a few other parts. And after making sure all the valves and everything are timed perfectly, this thing suddenly comes to life and it's powering a car. It sounds pretty generic because you hear cars and engines every day, but to actually build this mostly by yourself from scratch and actually have it run in an actual car that someone's going to use is a pretty cool thing. And the moral of the story is that if you don't know anything, just go and ask someone. Don't think that you know everything because honestly in the industry time is money, and make sure you know all the ins and outs before you go into something. Don't ever feel like you're bothering them or that you're being a nuisance, because at the end of the day, if you mess up, it's going to be a much bigger deal than taking a few minutes of your manager's time. Therefore, make sure everything is planned out without jumping into things and get things done the way they are supposed to. So that's my story working at BMW and almost blowing a project. And like I said, there's more of my work experience on my website and I'll be making more videos about them as well. So make sure you like and subscribe so that you don't miss those. That said, thank you so much for sticking till the end and I'll see you guys in the next one.